welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. In July, Pluto published the new book, Fascist Yoga, Grifters, Occultists, White Supremacists, and the New Order in Wellness by Stewart Home. Stewart is a legend of counterculture. He is an artist, filmmaker, pamphleteer, activist and historian, as well as the author of countless pulp fictions, including, most recently, Art School Orgy and She's My Witch. His new book exposes the weird and disturbing history of the cult of yoga, a landscape that, when one scratches beneath the surface, is full of anti-empiricism, occult delusions, and fascist conspiratorialism. It is my pleasure to bring you something a little bit different on the podcast today. A conversation between Stewart Home and my esteemed colleague Patrick Hughes. Patrick is a veteran of the book trade. He helped establish AK Press in the US in the early 90s, and he has published and engaged with Stewart's work for more than 30 years. In this episode, they talk about rock against racism, the National Front and the punk scene of the 1970s and 80s, as well as the theoretical explorations of anarchism and fascism that are present in some of Stewart's early novels. They also talk about the psychology and origins of fascism and the way that fascist thinking and white supremacism has and continues to infiltrate the yoga and wellness industries. As ever, podcast listeners can get 40% off the book, Fascist Yoga, through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcasts at the checkout. And we also have some lovely fascist yoga themed enamel pins for sale through the website as well. So do check those out. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is Stewart Home and Patrick Hughes on Radicals in Conversation.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's great to have this conversation. Stewart and I go back a long ways. My access with his writing began when I was working at the venerable anarchist bookstore in San Francisco called Bound Together. And we were trading, back and forth. So we were getting a lot of underground press from the UK in different places. And I came across his book called Assault on Culture, which I think was published by Aporia Press in like 1988. And it was what really was exciting for me is, as you develop like an understanding of like radical history, it was the first book that kind of took, for say something like the history and development of several post-war avant-garde art and political movements that sort of challenged the way history was perceived. And for me, I took a lot of it out of like interest in situationists and situationism that you spoke about there. And it was just a great lens. And it's really kind of been a way that I sort of view a lot of areas and just using that lens. So I'm very grateful for that. So we fast forward a bunch of years, and I was eventually the coordinator of Bound Together, which was I was kind of doing the finances for the store and a lot of the book buying. And so by 1993, I'd been doing a lot of trading back and forth with Ramsey Kannan of AK Press that was still based in Stirling and then Edinburgh, Scotland. And he fell in love with burritos in San Francisco and decided I was ripe for recruitment to start the AK Press in the U.S. And so we began that in like the spring of 1993. And at that time, there were two books. One was called No Pity, which was a collection of short stories, which I think I came out in 93. And then the other one was Red London. And these were literally in my long, almost 4-decade career in the book business. These were literally the first books I had ever written a press release for and was like hand selling out there. So it was really great to be involved in that. Those novels were also activating sort of these sort of like this sort of pulp and cult novels, and were very evocative of Richard Allen and also James Moffat and the Suede Head, the Skinhead, and my favorite Skinhead Girls novel. And so an opportunity arose where I guess Stewart, you were in New York and you sent us a note that you were in the States, and I was like, well, why don't you come over to the West Coast and we'll go on tour. So in 1995. Stewart and a great dissident and wonderful author named Peter Plate and I traveled from one end of the West Coast to the other. I mean, I think we started down in San Diego and ended up in Vancouver. And so that was a really great introduction for AK Press on the West Coast, but also kind of interacting with Stewart's fan base, which, doing these Richard Allen novels, there was a lot of baby skinheads, we call them, that would come to his events. And one of my favorite interactions is we were in Portland, and it was a huge show because we had a bunch of other writers, but all the baby skinheads, the suede heads, not like the fascist skinheads, but all the suede heads, the rude boys would come up and ask Stewart for acknowledgement of their approach to the skinhead wear, which was the Ben Sherman shirts, the right types of Levi's, the braces, the Doc Marten boots or whatnot. And they really, really wanted, an actual authentic Londoner to tell them they were doing it right.
No, they were doing it wrong. Their Fred Perrys weren't buttoned up. Terrible.
I know, but that was the most hilarious thing is seeing, Stewart just going through the line of these young, hopeful lads and telling them that everything they knew about skinhead fashion was wrong. And I'll never, they were crushed. I recall them complaining of how expensive it was to buy these English clothes.
Yeah, and then I said, but the button-downs are all copies of American shirts. Look, I've been buying loads for $1 in thrift stores, and I had a bag full of $1 thrift store American button-down shirts, which whereas they were buying expensive English imports. No need to do that because the English imports were copies of American stuff.
It was just a great introduction to Stewart and all of that. So we, fast forward many years later, and I had come on board to work with Pluto Press, and I reached out to Stewart to let him know that I was going to be in town at the London Book Fair, and he was very generous with his time and came out, and I was asking, what are you working on? And of all the stories that he was pitching, the idea of Fascist Yoga came up. And while it's this very serious work of scholarship, and I commend it, but I mean, it's very much in line with the assault on culture. I mean, it's deeply researched, tells the story. But it was I also am very appreciative of Stewart's allowing our ham-fisted kind of approach to the marketing copy and the hyperbole. I mean, while it is a serious book, we wanted to challenge people to get them to buy it, and I'm really appreciative of the response that we're getting. So, my interest for acquiring it for the press is really sparked by a connection between fascism and anarchism that I remember from those early novels, which included Defiant Pose, No Pity, Red London, and Blowjob. But so I'm kind of interested in the conversation today of kind of exploring your definition of fascism and how it evolved from theory and practice in the 20th and 21st century. So I guess my first question, because we both come out of the punk milieu, your introduction was way much earlier than mine. I mean, years ahead of me in the punk rock scene.
You're giving my age away.
I'm afraid I just had to do that. But do you identify as an anti-fascist?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back a long way. When Rock Against Racism happened in the UK, an anti-Nazi league, I was there, both at the small gigs, Hackney Town Hall, Brixton Town Hall, wherever, or, at the big rallies in Victoria Park in Hackney with X-Ray Specs and Steel Pulse, who were great, and the Clash, who weren't so great. I always thought they were a bit overhyped on how good they were as a live band. But Jimmy Percy from Sham 69 came on with the Clash at the end and saved the day. As Jimmy would. No, I'm kidding. A man now with a sex offence conviction, although I did used to go and see Sham back in the day, but I now claim only to see the support band Menace from Islington. But yeah, no, I mean, I identified with all that stuff, and it's funny because when I was waiting to get into the office here, across the road is the Lyceum Ballroom, across the Strand from Somerset House. And 78, 79, I used to go there very many Sundays because they'd have a punk multi-bill gig on. And, I was standing there looking at it thinking, I remember the first time people who were my mates rather than idiots at school, told me they joined the National Front. And these were kids from Paddington in West London who I'd met going to Ants gigs when the Ants were playing smaller venues in the Lyceum. And they'd become really good friends. And we were walking up the steps and going into the venue, and they're telling me they joined the National Front. And I'm like, what are you doing here? And we're here to see the Ants. Well, how come you want to see the Ants if you're a fash? Because, the drummer's half black and half Jewish and the singer's partly Romany. Oh, we came to see the support band. And that was the last time I talked to him. I just walked off and went into the gig and never spoke to him again. But, you're kind of forced to deal with it because people get drawn in. And so, that was the kind of early stuff. And then, other people I'd known from the punk scene, bands and things like Crisis, who I used to go and see a lot, their bass player joined the National Front and then got it, they had a band called Death in June after Crisis, who had a lot of dodgy songs. And even, when they were supposedly anti-racist, anti-fascist band, playing a lot of rock against racism, the lyrics to some of the songs got changed. So, for example, their song White Youth, we are black, we are white, together we are going to fight, got changed to we are dynamite to reflect their changing politics. So, there's a lot of things you just had to deal with going through that scene. I don't know if you experienced similar things with people.
Yeah, I did. I loved for a while you used, there was an author photo, or maybe it was in the back of just a couple of books, but you're at this like early Buzzcock show, and the author photo was a picture of you in the crowd.
That's Slaughtering the Dogs, the marquee.
Yeah.
That wasn't actually that early, that's 79, but it was just, I happened to be I think I was actually up on the stage because they totally oversold the gig. Because the marquee it's a few hundred people. I think they let 700 people in. And usually when you went there, it's probably 300-400 at the most. I just ended up in the photograph. But it was on the cover of the first edition of Cranked Up Really High, my book about punk rock, which was written in 3 weeks because I'd spent 20 years thinking about punk, so I didn't need to spend 20 years writing about it. Fastest I ever wrote a book.
We had a real problem in San Francisco in the late 80s, early 90s with the Aryan Nation skinheads. And it kind of culminated actually once when I was working in the bookstore and they firebombed it while I was like counting the till at the end of the shift. So, that sort of really started my exploration, or like my study of wanting to know, it's not just of how, but why. And so I'm hoping we could take a little bit to talk a little bit about your definition of fascism. And so I guess a good starting point is I have a few philosophers that I think that you would relate to, but the first is Klaus Thieveleit, the sociologist and the author of Male Fantasies. And he has this theory on fascism centering on the idea that it's not primarily an ideology, but a psychosocial condition of male bodies. I mean, especially as by the soldier male, the fascist archetype. And I guess the first question is sort of like, maybe talk a little about your ideas on like the gendered nature of fascism.
No, I mean, obviously it's patriarchal. And to go back to Thieveleit, I mean, he's analysing Freikorps literature, which are the kind of proto-Nazi military squads that formed after the war, and obviously also looking at figures like Ernst Jünger, who was actually a National Bolshevik, not a member of the Nazi Party, although he did write for the Völkische Beobachter, the Nazi paper. He's coming out of a kind of anti-Oedipal position, which is quite unusual for a German theorist to be using Deleuze and Guattari. And he's talking about the malformation of the fascist ego and how it's externalized and kind of stretched across the male body, essentially. And there's a kind of fear of the breakdown of that, which, on a more simplistic level, you might say that a lot of people are attracted to fascism because they don't have a lot of confidence and they're kind of lacking in a lot of things that most people have. I mean, I took that theory quite literally in Define Pose, which was the first of 3 novels I wrote, looking at kind of relationships between anarchism and fascism, because I was also reading authors like Z. Sternhill, who suggested that fascism was kind of created in France in 1913 from a kind of convergence of monarchist and Proudhonian, Proudhon obviously being the famous French anarchist, and kind of Sorelian currents, which I found quite interesting as well. So I wanted to use that within fiction, because I felt fiction was a space where I wasn't sure where I wanted to go theoretically with those ideas. The fiction, you could kind of play with the ideas and not necessarily have to work your way through them to the same degree as you would as if you were writing a theoretical text. I mean, that was quite misunderstood by some critics. So they found some of the characters who were ostensibly anarchists, and I never identified as an anarchist myself. Politically, the kind of key group that I'd gone to was London Workers' Group, which was an ultra-leftist group, not an anarchist group, which I first went to in 1979. And they were much more interested in trying to combine the best of left communism in the form of, say, councilism, of which the Situationists would be an example, but not the only example, and Bordegism, all the currents criticised by Lenin, left-wing communism and infantile disorder. But the anarchist characters, I took elements of Tableite's description of fear of breaking boundaries, fear of breakdown, and applied that very explicitly to the characters. And because people misread me as identifying with the anarchist characters in the book, who were painted in a somewhat fascistic way, I got accused of being a next-door neighbour to a brown shirt. Literally an editor from a big publishing house had heard what a fantastic writer I was, asked to see a manuscript, and then, wrote back saying, "No, you're a brown shirt."
Thiebaud talks about like the violent misogyny and the projection of like the fear of loss onto they're the enemies of these particular damaged individuals and onto women. Did you find that when you used that much violence in those early novels as kind of echoing that, and how was the response?
I mean, the response was varied. I started with a short story where I wasn't so explicitly using Tableite as in the first novel to do that, called Anarchist, and that, got an amazing reception from a lot of anarchists. They really liked it because maybe they liked reading about themselves. And that, again, I was combining other things. There were always different elements going on within the book. So I'd reread a lot of youth culture fiction that I'd read at school. So this is precisely the Skinhead, the Suede Head, but also Hell's Angels books. And in fact, that story was more modelled on a Hell's Angels book called Chopper by Peter Cave, which is about a rivalry between the president of the Hell's Angels chapter and his lieutenant, who thinks that the president is watering down the original outrageous aims of the Hell's Angels because he wants to settle down with his mama or his woman. So I applied that to anarchism, and of course, because anarchists aren't supposed to have leaders, you've got an immediate basis for humour within the book. So when the lieutenant starts thinking that the leader is watering down the aims of anarchism, he has to kind of cut the thought because anarchists don't have leaders. So yeah, it was mixing up those pulp elements. But if you look at the Richard Allen, those authors, they were mainly published by a publishing company called New English Library. And Richard Allen was actually a Canadian called James Moffat, and he had very right-wing racist views, and describes rapes in his book where the DNA takes over and the woman being raped enjoys it. It's completely misogynistic. But on the other hand, you had people like Lawrence James, who wrote as Mick Norman, wrote Hell's Angels books, in which the gay angels were even harder than the straight angels, and the Angry Brigade had been a hope for freedom. The actual English group who bombed property, not people. But, since they'd been imprisoned, the Angels were the last hope for kind of freedom in the UK. And he had actually edited all the early Richard Allen, James Moffat's youth culture books, but had stopped because he got so angry about the racism within the books. I mean, I tracked him down years later and interviewed him. Sadly, he's been dead for more than 20 years now, but it was an attempt to mix up those kind of things. So Table Light was one element within that, but not the only element. And I wasn't trying to produce as theoretical a text as Table Light. But the reaction was horror on some people's part and a huge amusement on other people's part. The audience was quite divided.
A lot of people's perception of fascism is really coming out of, economic crises of like the late 19th century, early 20th, and whatnot. But Wilhelm Reich, in his mass psychology of fascism, talks about it as a psychopathology and what he calls like an irrational character structure. Was that something you had in mind with building some of the characters you wrote about?
I had read Reich, but I hadn't read him for a long time, and obviously I had Table Light because his 2 volumes of male fantasies are quite long and were quite cult-like around Compendium Bookshop at that time. So I was much, I think you can see a lineage there, but I was much more drawing on the more recent writers and more probably interested in some of those currents that fed into postmodernism than going back to Reich. I mean, subsequent to writing the books, one of the interesting essays on fascism that came out was the is it called Fascism, the Umberto Eco essay? You know this essay where he says fascism could take many different forms. He says it will have one of the following elements. There's about 14 elements, so it could be authoritarian. It's quite likely to be backward-looking and traditionalist, but doesn't necessarily have to be so. And he takes all these examples, particularly from Italian fascism, of how fascism can be contradictory, but it's about combining certain elements so that you can have forms of fascism that share the same elements, but also forms of fascism that don't share any of the same elements because of various contradictory elements that fascism picks up on. I don't know how much I'd want to make it about a pathological response to society, but there's certainly elements of that there in the novels I wrote.
Mm-hmm. So Reich identifies something he calls like organized mysticism, the belief that supernatural authority and the denial of rational inquiry as a psychological foundation of fascist movements. Was that something that was on your radar when you started looking at the origins of fascism or your definition of fascism?
Probably not, because I probably read Reich. I'm trying to remember when I read him, but it was probably when I was teenage. And I'd moved to reading more contemporary theoretical texts. Maybe I should go back to Reich, but also the kind of development in the ideas of orgone energy and the paranoia later on, which, may be related to persecution, made Reich a little bit off-putting to me. I do remember reading Listen, Little Man at some point as well, and some big books by Reich. But no, I wasn't particularly looking at that stuff when I was writing it. Those were things that I read a long time before, so maybe there was an underlying trace, but it certainly wasn't where I was focused.
You had an earlier conversation where you referenced Jacques Camat. Could you talk about your experience with reading him and his Marxist analysis of fascism?
A lot of his work wasn't available in English, and while it's easier to read Marxism than French, and you can look at Marxism in French and think that you can read some French, but you're actually reading Marxism. I did do basic French at school, but I don't really have any. So I had to look at what was available in English, and one of the people I'd met through London Workers Group, Richard Essex, as his kind of public name, who went on to do the London Psychogeographical Association, was translating a lot of material, not just from French, which he spoke reasonably well, but also languages he didn't necessarily speak well with a dictionary, and publishing them as unpopular books. He was actually the co-publisher with Aporia Press of the Assault on Culture. Kamat was making a critique of, in The Echo of Time, of the Nouvelle Droite, or the French New Right of the 1960s, figures like Alain de Benoist and Guillaume Arfay, and looking at the way in which they were using a meta-political strategy, I guess, to try and disguise their fascism. So because after the defeat of the Axis powers for some decades, it was not cool to be a fascist, they were trying to repackage that in a cultural form, not necessarily informing people of what their positions were. So Kamat was addressing that and showing where they really came from. Yeah, that was something I drew upon in my understanding of different forms of fascism, and the way that within scenes like Neofolk, which is key to those bands like Death in June, you could see that flirting with fascism while denying that one was fascist.
Now, you've written about how fascism and far-right ideas sometimes creep into like the yoga and wellness spaces. How many in the yoga and wellness world are suspicious or reject mainstream expertise in science, especially after the pandemic. Thibelite and Reich talk about fascism as kind of a psychological projection. Do you think that this attraction to far-right ideologies in yoga circles comes from a deeper struggles with identity, control, or maybe even spiritual emptiness?
Yeah, it probably does. I think one of the problems with when you criticize yoga is that people identify as yogis in a way that the average guy in the gym who does weight training doesn't identify as a weight trainer, so that they don't feel their entire identity threatened if you criticize their bench press or deadlift or something, or suggest that maybe running is a superior form of exercise, that they can cope with it. They may not agree, but I think yoga attracts a kind of cult-like element, which is the relationship between the instructors and the students is extremely hierarchical, and people come to identify themselves with the practice in a way that they don't with other forms of sport and exercise. On the whole, I mean, so you do see some of the same problems with, say, martial arts clubs and forms of martial art, and also the yoga's claim to greatness is that it's a throwback to a world that was more natural, because it's supposedly, according to the claims of some of the teachers, thousands of years old, even 5,000 years old. So I do think that there is a kind of an identification that leads people to feel very threatened when you criticize what they're doing. Although, to be honest, because we have social media now, and I'm quite contactable by a lot of people, I've been surprised by the number of yoga teachers, and probably more teachers than practitioners, but also practitioners who've actually contacted me and say, it's fantastic that I'm talking about this, and even if they don't agree with all of it, they do actually recognize there is a problem, and they're not taking it as a personal attack on them.
Your book explores the occult and mystical roots of modern yoga, which sometimes overlaps with the esoteric fascist ideas of the early 20th century. We were speaking about those three philosophers and whatnot, and so there's this mystical element.
Yeah.
And so how does that square against sort of like with Abelard and Reich, would sort of place it as sort of disordered individuals, disordered alienated males, rather than the economic circumstance? And then, Kamat talks about it in the sense of it was a failure of the socialist and communist revolutions to, move society along.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering where you place the kind of the mystical side, because I know your research also includes, you talk about Crowley, the Golden Dawn, and some of the con artists and charlatans that were involved in England in the early part of the 20th century. And so I was just sort of trying to add a dimension in there on the mysticism that you talk extensively at the earlier parts of the book.
Yeah, well, I think it becomes a collective delusion. And obviously, if you're tracking back from Table-I into Deleuze and Guattari, critiques of madness as a social phenomena. We may appear to be individuals, but actually the whole of society is affecting us. So I don't think you can entirely remove it from social and economic positions, which someone like Kamat is very interested in. I'd need to go back to Reich to really get a position on where he is. But I think the mystical elements, people are producing a collective belief system, so it can't all be individualized pathology, because there's a shared delusion, if you like. The Crowley, going back through Blavatsky and Theosophy in the 19th century, that's where a lot of the kind of Orientalist fairy dust that you find within yoga originates. So Blavatsky, and then the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, not to be confused with the Greek political party, which Crowley was a member of. They claim to have hidden masters in the Himalayas, and this was where their teachings came from. Of course they didn't, but that claim is where part of that fascination with the Eastern mysticism comes from. And that was developed collectively. It's not just one person's crazy ideas, it's the crazy ideas of a group of people.
Well, it's well known that in history, but even contemporary fascist movements, manipulate people's fears and desires to build their followings. I mean, do you see that kind of charisma, maybe exploitation in today's yoga and wellness, these gurus? Perhaps somebody like Alex Jones has dipped into that world. Are there others that fit that mold?
Yeah, I mean, they're all exploit. What fascism does is offer false solutions to real problems, because people do have real problems, from having enough to eat through to having a sense of self-worth, which is the more psychological aspect. And what the mysticism does, the same as fascism does, it offers people a chance to be part of an elite group, even if they're at the bottom end of the elite group. Whether that's in terms of nation or kind of occult initiation, it's giving people a sense of self-worth, because even if they're the lowest within the group, they're better than the out-group. And that's, the appeal of fascism, and I think a lot of hierarchical occultism. I wouldn't necessarily include all forms of occultism. There's obviously clear splits between, say, a kind of more male-gendered ceremonial magic, which is precisely what you've got coming out of things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and a kind of more proletarian witchcraft, which is obviously more gendered feminine, although neither are exclusively one or the other. It's not to say there aren't problematic beliefs within kind of the witchcraft scene. And again, you have books like Ron Hutton's The Triumph of the Moon, kind of describing how witchcraft was invented in the 20th century from a mixture of kind of Freemasonry, Margaret Murray, interests in BDSM and stuff. So there's a whole sense of appeal within that kind of more elitist thing of being, or even, the witchcraft of having a certain knowledge and knowing things that other people don't know, and being part of an in-group, I think. So it is providing an appeal to people who feel something lacking and a lack of confidence.
If we could extend a critique that the left hasn't, in the last, say 50 years, the left hasn't really provided much succor, and this alienation has really taken hold, and how it leaves this opening for fascism, in the sense that we're seeing this sort of closing of the gap in terms of these far right ideologies like QAnon or anti-vax, anti-science. Do you think yoga and wellness movements have accidentally created this opening for their adherents? Have they become the space where these far right ideas are taking hold?
I don't think it's entirely accidental. I mean, I think with some people it's unconscious and accidental, but with others it's quite deliberate. So if you go back to Pierre Bernard, who didn't really write a huge amount himself, but his followers, such as Hamish McLaren, wrote Eastern Philosophy for Western Minds, and he seems to hold the same views as Bernard. So when you look at the what we believe dates from about 1906, although there's no sure dating, the Journal of the International Tantric Order, which Bernard ran, there's a lot of its citation rather than Bernard's original writing, but there's references to the Aryan origins of yoga. And then in McLaren and also Francis Yates Brown, who was another follower of Bernard, who wrote a book called Yoga Explained, and wrote the introduction to McLaren's book. Their argument is that yoga originated with the blonde Aryan invaders of the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago. And obviously the Aryan was originally a kind of linguistic cultural group. It wasn't intended to be a racial designation, but was taken up in that way in racist theory, including by the Nazis. But McLaren and then Yates Brown's argument, who are the two of the key followers of Pierre Bernard, is that this is the true heritage of white Europeans, and that the blue-eyed, blonde-haired, beef-eating Brahmins of the Indus Valley, because the Aryans introduced the caste system as well as inventing yoga. They invented the caste system to maintain their racial purity. They invented yoga and it's Aryan, and in actual fact, McLaren is very explicit on this. Yoga is a superior form of spiritual culture for white Europeans, precisely because it is Aryan and Christianity is not, because it's Semitic. And he is quite anti-Semitic in that book as well. So in those kind of terms, I don't think that is accidental. I think that's quite deliberate. Later on, you have figures who may have kind of expressed anti-racist views, but they also reproduce some of these views and quote people like Yates Brown. For example, Harvey Days in the book. He is explicitly anti-racist in some of his writing and explicitly anti-Nazi. But at the same time, he goes along with this myth of the Aryan origins of yoga. And again, it can be tied back through Blavatsky and the Theosophy movement in the 19th century, and you see it going forward with people embracing those kind of ideas. I mean, when you get into things like runic yoga, again, people have all sorts of variations of yoga, and some of those are quite kind of problematic, and you see a kind of mixing with goth culture when you have the doom yoga classes and all that kind of stuff, some of which may be explicitly fascist and some may not be. But it's not purely accidental. I think, if you think of it in terms of fascist metapolitical strategy, it's some people using those ideas to draw others in who may not be as conscious of what's going on.
I have been somewhat fascinated by the West's interest in Hinduism because the caste system is quite brutal. And my entree to that was hearing about the Vedanta Society and Christopher Isherwood's book, My Guru, His Disciple, which talks about, the Swami Vivekananda coming over to the United States and preaching them as an advanced sort of spiritual practice. Like, I never understood its appeal, because the Vedanta Society, if you go to India, treats the poor, but yet the Vedanta Society that Christopher Isherwood belonged to in the early part of the 20th century is Hollywood, was all wealthy white people. Do you think that the fascination of of that Orientalism that was happening also in the UK at the same time, how do they manage to paper over like such a stark religious belief with these kind of racial purity ideas, especially amongst the racist upper class in England?
I think they could just live with the contradictions, and it didn't really bother them. They were taking what they wanted and could leave the rest. And it's the same as when you look at a lot of charity, because people in the upper classes and people with a lot of money will justify all sorts of things on the basis that they give to charity, so they're, if they're involved with the religion, they think they're giving something spiritual to the world, which is of great value, and the rest of what they do isn't really that significant. It's hard to know how much people actually believe this and how much it's conscious manipulation. But when you look at charity, it's people deciding to give out crumbs to the poor, and don't the poor actually have a right to the world's resources the same as everyone should have an equal right? But I think it's reflecting that same attitude.
Absolutely.
A lot of those rich upper class people are kind of bored because they don't need to struggle to get anything, so they just look for something to fill a hole in their life, and whether it's Orientalist religion, which bears little relation to the religions it would be practiced in India, and also Vivekananda reconfigured a lot of the Hindu beliefs at the end of the 19th century, probably to make them more appealing to rich Westerners like Christopher Isherwood.
Yeah, exactly. So in the time we have left, I wanted to sort of move forward because we're facing a period, where fascist ideology is on the rise. You have the MSI, the Italian social movement. You have the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and then in this hemisphere, you have the populism of Bolsonaro in Brazil and Trumpism in the UK, in the US. It's sort of adopting to a new form of alienation, and I thought maybe we could have, a chat of besides these far right ideas making its way into yoga and wellness culture. I thought maybe you might have some thoughts on these sort of internet based incel culture and how that they are highly motivated and highly organized with these sort of burgeoning fascist movements.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in all sorts of places. I mean, obviously, one of the most prominent, although it's related to incel rather than incel, would be, say, the Tate brothers with the War Room. Although, they appear to have a kind of older salesman behind them who's pushing a lot of the ideas. I mean, what you're seeing, it's partly the algorithms just pushing a more and more extreme version of things at people, so people become bored with the kind of standard version and get moved to a more extreme version. So you have the incels who say they can't, they have a right to sex with women or whatever, but they can't get sex with women because of feminism, which actually, feminism is a great thing and important to have equality of all forms, intersectional equality. You see this kind of obsession with literal violence and evil. Not that I necessarily believe in evil as in any kind of religious way, but you have, say, the occult gangs, whether it's in Haiti or in South Africa, who have mixed elements of African religion with Western esotericism and Satanism. And use that for power. And I think a lot of it is people desperate for power, the incels as well, prepared to go out and kill people for no good reason as far as you can see. But you also see it with the Nazi Satanism and the groups that try and snare kind of vulnerable young women online and get themselves to cut themselves up and all that kind of stuff. It is a sign of immense alienation, and how you deal with that is one I think you have to kind of literally fight back against it and do something about the people involved in that stuff. But it's across a broad spectrum of kind of movements. It's into gang culture, and you are seeing what are turned devil gangs or occult gangs. Alongside the kind of Nazi Satanists, which comes out of groups like the Order of Nine Angles, and the kind of feeds into all the now accelerationist neo-Nazi terror cells. And you're also seeing quite a split between, a gendered split politically, with younger women tending to go more to the left and with the ecological issues, and younger men more to the right, and also, apart from Orientalism, being attracted to traditionalist Catholicism. I don't know if you've noticed how big that's been lately, but that's quite a trend. What we need to do is attack the basis of this, and there's such a hybridity, and fascist culture has always been changing and hybrid and adopting elements of leftist rhetoric so that it sounds liberationist without being so. But exposing those kind of roots. So when you go back through of the esoteric Hitlerism of Savitri Devi or Miguel Serrano, who claimed that Hitler, well, in Davies' case, Hitler was the 10th incarnation of Vishnu or Kalki. So Hitler was a supernatural being who'd come to save humanity. There's enormous parallels between that and QAnon theory, where Trump is portrayed as this kind of supernatural entity who's come to save humanity. So I think what you have to do is deconstruct those beliefs and challenge those beliefs, which seem absurd, so people aren't necessarily prepared to take the beliefs on. And it's hard to know how much of the belief with some people is play acting, certainly among the leadership, and how much is real belief, which seems to be more with the lower ends of those kind of movements. And point out those parallels and point out where those ideas come from. I mean, there's no evidence of a direct transmission of the esoteric Hitlerism into QAnon, but we don't know everything about the origins of QAnon anyway. But it doesn't matter. But to point towards those things and to also offer an alternative, a fully socialist alternative, basically.
It seems to me that the language, we are failing to address or counter, the misogyny, which is like this organizing tool.
Yeah.
And how with that as sort of a baseline, this resentment, and how that it's making these individuals, more receptive, like far right and anti-democratic political projects. This control issue.
Yeah, well, I think the misogyny is coming again out of a desire to create an in-group and an out-group. So, by saying women are inferior, and also people can use ideas from Orientalist and Orientalized religions about reincarnation, and so precisely if you're going to kind of reach samadhi or be kind of the idea not to reincarnate, but that goes through a hierarchy from low animals to higher animals to female to male. And obviously you can use Christian variants of that. Then you're going to, you're creating that out-group group, which is anyone who's gendered female, and that includes LBGT people. And then you direct violence against the outgroup, scapegoating in the sense of René Girard.
When you think about these tools and these kind of methods of control, it's like, if you look at like Yogi Bhajan, who founded the Kundalini Yoga, came over to the United States in the late 60s, escaping the police for crimes he committed there, and formed a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, it seems to attract both men and women. Is there something unique to using yoga as a method of control over these groups?
What's interesting in your question is or one of the things that's interesting, is the gendered nature of yoga, because the bulk of the people going to yoga classes are women, cis women. And although a lot of the teachers are women, the people who found the systems tend to be men. I tried dozens and dozens of different yoga systems. And of those, there was at the local gym, there was a system taught that was Brazilian, which had been invented by a woman. And there was sometimes a cover teacher who taught forest yoga, meant to be about processing trauma, who so obviously that's a system invented by a woman. But all the other systems were attributed to male inventors. And often it's men at the top, like Bikram. You will come across male yoga instructors, but the vast majority are women. The people at the top are men, which is, curious and reflective of a kind of misogynistic culture that we live in.
So are these women leaders, are they buying into this patriarchal control?
To some degree, some of them are. The first yoga teacher I went to was an Anusara yoga teacher, following a style invented by John Friend in America. People can buy in and buy out. when the sex scandal around Friend broke, which was certainly not as horrendous as some of the others, and also the fact that he'd played fast and loose with the superannuation of his employees. This was in 2012. She stopped teaching Anusara yoga. She carried on doing some yoga teaching, but she was mixing in Tai Chi and other stuff, which you'd also find in other systems like monks invented by Jonathan Monks, but that wasn't what she was using. But eventually she retrained as a Pilates teacher. Which gives us our takeaway, try Pilates, although try weight training. So yeah, but to some extent I think she'd spent a lot of money training in Anusara, precisely because it was very fashionable at the time she decided to become a yoga teacher, I guess, and bought into the kind of myth. He had the Wiccan Coven as well, was part of the scandal, doing nude rituals, of which he was the only male member of the Wiccan Coven, formed from some of his top kind of people in his yoga organisation, and having employees receive packages of drugs for him and stuff like that on top. So he was prepared to put them at risk.
Well, one of my favorite true crime books is called Monkey on a Stick, and it's about the extension of like Ishkan consciousness, or the Hare Krishnas in the United States, and after Prabhupada died. And so they're all gangsters. I mean, like, we're talking like trunks full of automatic weapons, satchels of cocaine in the safes, and how they were, using the veneer of Hinduism and meditation to like hide this venal criminality, in the sense that they were building this at one time in the 70s. They were going to build this sort of Hare Krishna temple in West Virginia, and they were burying the bodies of their enemies and like vanquished drug foes in the cement that were the foundations of these buildings. I mean, like, the list goes on.
Yeah. And you can find not necessarily the guns, but a similar level of grifting in Christian megachurches, where people are expected,
Absolutely.
prosperity gospel, people are expected to tithe money they can't afford when they're poor and struggling, and told that if they don't do this, they won't prosper under God,
We're sort of moving into like prepper territory, or like apocalypticism, and the idea of Alex Jones sells all of the vitamins. And I saw a video recently of the disgraced evangelical American Jim Bakker, like, selling prepper, several years worth of dehydrated food, and in front of this audience that's normally them preaching the gospel, as him eating fistfuls of reconstituted rice to show how delicious it is. And instead of saying, this is going to cost you $25.95, these are all gifts as a result of your pledges to their church. But I can only imagine that the food must be dreadful. But I mean, we all know, based on the trials of what happened with the Connecticut shootings, like, how much money is being made with these prosperity gospel types, or these apocalyptic preachers.
No, and it's, the scientific evidence is actually against supplements having any real value at all. You're better off just eating a healthy diet without a lot of processed food. You don't need the supplements. And, there's a whole history of that. I mean, I go back in the book to James Lee Richardson, who wrote yoga books and did a yoga mail order course as Desmond Dunn. And, he was also publishing things like the UK edition of Fate, so you have all these stories about UFOs and other nonsense, but was making a lot of money from his health crafts firm that sold supplements and, promising all sorts of wonder cures from, you don't know quite what he was putting together. I mean, Vice also tested Alex Jones's supplements, and while they were whatever it was, 4 times more expensive than the average supplement, they actually had weaker ingredients, so they were going to do you even less good than the supplements that you actually don't need to take anyway.
But it's a con. But like, by consuming these products, I think you're part of their culture. You're on the inside.
Exactly.
Which,
yeah.
Again, is that sense of belonging. So I guess my last thoughts, given that we're talking about these books, I loved how in Fascist Yoga, everyone seems to have a book. I mean, you go through it, but as our shared interest in anomalous information, I thought we would talk about Indra Devi. And most people know her through, you also referenced the book of Michelle Goldberg's Goddess Pose. However, Devi's book, Forever Young, Forever Healthy, was published by education publisher Prentice Hall in the early 50s. Yet little did we know that Prentice Hall also had this totally bizarre Parker imprint that published things like Walter Laney's Ultra Psionics, How to Work Miracles with Limitless Power of Psychoatomic Energy, and my favorite, Anne Bodenhammer Martin's Metabionics. Now, I think you have a fascination with Parker. I thought maybe you could talk about your collection and maybe tell everyone a little bit what you know about Parker and some of the weird shit that they put out.
Yeah, I mean, Parker, I probably first came across due to Frank Rudolph Young, who they also published through the 60s and 70s. The man who in his books claimed that he was going to live to be at least 330 years old, and you could too if you followed his yogic and occult exercises. Their books are just stuffed with, to make them long enough, with testimonials from people which are obviously completely fake. So it's all about how whoever took control of his life and dealt with his nagging spendthrift wife by following Frank Rudolph Young's advice and became a man again. Young also kind of did How to Control the Other Sex type books, so he's a precursor for the pickup artist. But Parker, they used this style of having these testimonial stories scattered through the books, including Indra Davies and Frank Rudolph Young's. But there's just hundreds and hundreds of these books, so they tend to be occult or systems and occasionally health systems like Yoga for Men by Frank Rudolph Young. And they're the corollary of the white-collar books that Prentice Hall published under their own name, or sort of not as the Parker imprint, which are basically, how to do management and how to succeed as a businessman type book. And the Parker occult books like, Protect Yourself with Spells, Curses and Chants or whatever, were aimed at a more blue-collar audience, but they're both self-help books, but basically kind of pitched to the level of economic availability of resources to a kind of white-collar and a blue-collar audience. But there are just hundreds and hundreds of these books, and the Walter Delaney was actually a Prentice Hall editor who got fed up with seeing how much money the authors were making from the Parker books he was editing, so he decided to write one himself, but it was entirely a spoof. But apparently he made an awful lot of money from the book.
Well, Stewart, really appreciate you coming in to talk to your old friend about this book, and I'm really glad that you published it with Pluto Press, because I really am enjoying this kind of connection to the work that we did together in the past, and then seeing how your scholarship has deepened and developed and have written, which is it's just a terrifically interesting and well-researched book. And so it's been a pleasure to work on this project and speaking with you here today. So thanks very much for joining us.
No, it's been great working with Pluto, and I actually ended up with two editors on the book who were both very interesting to work with, David and Ken. So thanks to them as well, and thanks to you for suggesting I sign to Pluto.
Cog in the machine. So thanks.
That was Patrick Hughes and Stewart Home on Radicals in Conversation. Once again, Fascist Yoga, Grifters, Occultists, White Supremacists, and the New Order in Wellness is out now from Pluto Press. Podcast listeners can get 40% off the book using the coupon podcast at the checkout. If you enjoyed this episode, then please don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. We'll be back in just a few weeks' time with our next episode of Radicals in Conversation. So until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.